everybody, I'm Matt Bean, and I'm the senior pastor here at Redeemer Lutheran Church in Richmond, Virginia. Thank you for joining us for our 5-part video series entitled Effective Congregational Leadership. I hope that this set of videos has been helpful to you and that it's helped you grow in your own personal leadership and your leadership of whatever context God has placed you in, whatever ministry context God has placed you in. Whether that's as a formal leadership in a congregation or whether it's somebody who's sitting in the pew and you're learning about and growing in your own leadership in your family, in your neighborhood, in your workplace or school, or whatever that context that God has placed you in, that you've been learning about leadership and trying to apply those gifts of leadership within your ministry context. So today we're looking at our 4th video in this video series, which is on organizational leadership. And this video really is oriented to how I see the local congregation functioning, okay? And what leadership looks like in the context of the local congregation. So really what we're going to be talking about today is really 2 questions, these 2 questions that are here. Really, we're going to be looking at 3 leadership functions and those leadership functions within the local congregation. And then we'll also talk about, as kind of on the opposite side of the coin, organizational dysfunction. So those are the 2 issues, the 2 topics we're going to be looking at today. So let's start off by taking a look at 3 leadership functions within an organization, and particularly we're going to be talking a lot about what this looks like within the local congregation, and there's going to be some reference to what's going on here at Redeemer and how Redeemer as an organization functions, okay? So basically how I look at things is that there are basically 3 functions. There's 3 leadership functions within a church, okay? There's the strategic function, the management function, and the task function. Now, let me talk about what those 3 functions are really all about. The strategic function is all about future direction, large priorities, asking the question, where has God positioned us today, and what does this church, what is God leading us to do in the next several years of this ministry? What is this church going to look like in 3 to 5 years? And starting to develop strategic priorities and purposes for the organization, for the church. It's really, again, forward-looking, it's futuristic-looking, it's trying to assess, okay, these are the challenges, these are the opportunities that we are witnessing over the next several years, and so here's how we are going to position our church in order to respond to those opportunities and those challenges, okay? Now, obviously, when it comes to strategy, nobody knows everything, nobody can see everything, but the function of the strategy, of the strategic purpose, is really to look forward and to start thinking about what are the things that we need to be doing in this church to be faithful stewards of what God has given to us in this church. Okay, so that's the strategic function. The next function is the management function, which is kind of the part of the function that says, okay, if these are our priorities, if this is the 3 most important things that we need to be doing this year, then how do we do those things well? Okay, and the management function is looking at processes, it's looking at outcomes, it's looking at projects, it's looking at the significant things that are going to be serving those strategic functions, those strategic priorities. And so, okay, how can we do these things well? How can we make sure that all of the trains arrive at the station at the right time? Okay, that's the kind of management function. How do we make sure that everything is running well? And then there's the task function, which is simply, okay, if we're going to do this job, if we're going to do this task, then we need to put people behind it, we need to put resources behind it. And the task function can be from everything from an event that's going to be going on, a fellowship event, or in Redeemer's case, like a community engagement event, one of those bridge building events we have with our community, with our Child Development Center family, or it can be a movie night, or it can be Vacation Bible School, or those kinds of things. If we're going to have an event, if we're going to have a thing, how do we make sure that we put enough people behind that we put enough resources behind that, so that again it goes well? All right, so those are really the 3 functions that I look at in a church. Okay, there's the strategic function, the management function, and the task function. Now, the Bible talks about how these are supposed to work together, how these three functions are supposed together. And it doesn't use these words necessarily, but it does give us some indications about how these functions within the church can be done well, right? So there's this language from 1 Corinthians chapter 4, where Paul writes, there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit. And then Paul goes on to talk about the body of Christ and the giftedness of the body of Christ, right? That there are eyes, that there are hands, that there are feet, there are mouths. And each one of those parts of the body has its function, its job to do. And each part of those body has to focus on its own job, right? And not worry about the other jobs, not worry about the other functions within the body, because, the feet are going to do the feet business, the hands are going to do the hand business, etc. Okay? So what does this really mean for the local congregation? Well, here's how I look at this whole construct of what Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Listen, God has given some people the kinds of gifts that are perfectly applied in the strategic functions, in the strategic areas. God has given some people gifts that are meant to be perfectly applied in the management functions, the management area. God has given some people gifts that can be perfectly applied in the task area. And so strategic gifted people do strategic things, and management gifted people do management things, and task-oriented people do task things. But the thing is, if you take those people out of their specific area where their specific gifts are, and you try to put them in a different area, those people can really be frustrated because they don't have the appropriate gifts. Task people don't have the kinds of gifts that can serve real well in strategic functions. And while strategic people may be able to function in management functions, boy, they're probably going to get frustrated if they're in the management area too long, and so on and so on and so on. You can tarry those things and apply those things in all kinds of different ways. The point is this: God has given people specific gifts to function most effectively in these areas. And so one of the things that churches and leaders of churches need to be thinking about constantly is how can we make sure that we right-size people's gifts with their leadership functions? Because each one of these areas has leadership functions. There's strategic leadership, there's management leadership, there's task leadership. And there's people that lead in each one of those areas well, but if you take them out of those areas and put them in another place, they probably are not going to function real well. So one of the responsibilities of leadership is to say, this is a person who has great management gifts. Let's make sure we help them to thrive in that space. This is a person who has great task leadership gifts. Let's make sure we put them in there and help them to thrive there. This is a person who has strategic gifts. Let us make sure that we put that person in that space to help them to thrive using their strategic leadership gifts, okay? That's one of the functions of congregational leadership, which kind of leads me to this place of organizational dysfunction, okay? I really see the three leadership functions within the local congregation, and particularly at Redeemer, working this way. You have strategic gifts that are going to be operating on board level and high-level management processes, okay? You have management people that are your staff, your key volunteers, and key volunteers that are going to be running processes and managing significant processes. Then you have your task-oriented people who are your teams, your groups, your individuals that are going to run a team well and do a job well and do a task well, okay? That's really how I see these. The strategy folks are going to be great on boards, on governing issues, on establishing priorities for the future, those kinds of things. Management people are going to be staff, your key volunteers, tasks are going to be teams and groups of individuals. Now, when we talk about organizational dysfunction, here's what really we're talking about. When governance fails to provide clear strategic leadership, fails to define what those strategic priorities are and where we should be in the next 5 to 10 years. When they obsess about management, staff, processes, tasks, or outcome. When strategic-minded leadership, when governance starts to spend too much time in these areas, boy, it tells me something's wrong, okay? It tells me that there's some dysfunction going on. Or when management fails to communicate strategic priorities, processes, and expectations to the rest of the organization, when they fail to delegate tasks, when they fail to hold people accountable to performing those tasks, when management starts to actually do stuff, to do tasks, to perform tasks, again, that's some dysfunction going on there. Warren Bennis says this, and I think this is a great quote, particularly about the church. Failing organizations are usually overmanaged and underled. The leadership part, what he's talking about here, is the strategic part. It is the part that says, here's where we're going, folks, in the next 5 years. Here's what we need to be doing. Here's those priorities that we have to set out for ourselves. And then basically what he's saying is failing organizations usually spend too much time in the management areas and not enough time in the strategic areas. Okay, that's important, and I think that's where the American church is today. Okay, I don't think there's enough time going into strategic functions. So here's 2 questions that I'd like you to think about, 2 application questions I'd like you to think about in this area. So church leaders, here's the first question. How is your organization functioning? Are strategic people doing strategic things? Are management people doing management things? Are task-oriented people doing task things? Or is there confusion about those roles? Second, what leadership application is needed? Remember how we've talked about the application of leadership is where we apply influence to change the trajectory of the organization so that it does a better job fulfilling its mission and vision, right? That's essentially the working definition we've been using for leadership in this whole area, where leadership is the application of influence to change the direction of the organization so that it fulfills its mission and vision, okay? So the question is, if there's organizational dysfunction going on, then how do we apply influence? How do we apply leadership at that place of dysfunction so that the organization changes trajectory and now can fulfill its mission vision? So I'd like you to think about that. Take some time this week to reflect upon that within your congregation, within your place of leadership, within whatever context you have, and to think about that from an organizational and structural level. Are strategic people doing what strategic people need to do? Are management people doing what management people need to do? Are task-oriented people doing what task people need to do? Okay, and are we make sure that we're functioning well in all of those spaces? All right, so thank you again for tuning into this video, this 4th video in our Effective Congregational Leadership series. I hope that this has been a blessing to you. There's going to be one more video in our video series where we're going to be looking at leadership and the application of leadership in an emotional system, and I'll talk to you about what that means during our next video. I think this next video is probably the most important video in the entire series, okay? I think video number 5 is the most important video in the entire series. So again, look forward to seeing you at our next video. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.